you everybody in 3 dimensions today. Thanks for coming in person, yay. But there's a lot of faces I don't know. So if you all wouldn't mind, we're gonna just start by going around the room. If you could introduce yourself and let us know which agency you are representing, and we'll start with Lissa.
Lissa Leitner, Washington County.
Jim Kazlucher, City of Fairfield.
Paul Olney, City of Lakeville.
Ross Beckwith, City of West St. Paul.
Chad Ellis, Hennepin County.
Kelsey Pope, City of Minneapolis.
April Crockett, MnDOT Metro District.
Mackenzie Turner Bargain here as the pedestrian rep.
Elaine Kutsukos, Tab Coordinator.
I'm Jeni Hager. I represent Minneapolis, and I'm also TAC Chair.
Joe Barbeau, the council staff member.
Brian Isaacson, Ramsey County.
Colleen Addy, State of Minnesota Deed.
Gina Medico, Dakota County.
Joe McPherson, Anoka County.
Lyndon Rob Gent, Carver County.
Craig Jensen, Scott County.
Innocente, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
Mike Larson, Metropolitan Council Community Development Division.
Michael Thompson, Plymouth.
Bill Dermody, City of St. Paul.
Matt Fighton, Suburban Transit Association.
Robert Ellis, City of Eden Prairie.
Adam Harrington, Metro Transit.
Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Steve Peterson, Met Council.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We don't have name tags like we normally would, so please accept my apologies in advance if I do forget some newer names, but I will do my very best. We have an agenda before us today. Are there any changes or amendments to the agenda by committee members? Seeing none, the agenda is approved, and we will move to approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Were we able to bring those, or do people have those in front of them? Does anybody need copies of those? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
There's a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion on the minutes? All those in favor signify by voice vote. Say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Great, the minutes are approved. And Joe is so happy. All right, is there anyone here from the public who wants to comment on the committee business today? All right, seeing none, then we'll move to the TAB report. Elaine.
Thank you, Chair. TAB met on April 19th. For the Chair's report, Chair Hovland welcomed Glenn Johnson, who's now officially a TAB representative. He had been serving as alternate. And they also discussed items. The TAB Executive Committee had met, and they discussed some program year shifting of projects, that whether they would be eligible to bring forward action items, and they've agreed to let them come through the committees and they will be coming through funding and programming next month and into TAC. From MnDOT report, Michael Barnes reported that MnDOT is moving into construction season, and through April 16th, there were 57 traffic-related deaths. This was 26% less than the same time last year. He also announced that there were a Towards Zero Deaths workshop that will be held on May 9th, and registration was April 25th deadline. So I don't know if, hopefully you've all been able to register for that. For the MPCA, Todd Bewin provided an update on the BW program. Minnesota received $47 million to offset emissions. They've completed 2 phases of a 7-year program, and phase 3 is starting and will go through 2027. MPCA is also applying for a $3 million planning grant from the Inflation Reduction Act, and all municipalities will be covered by the grant if they receive it. For the Metropolitan Airports Commission, Carl Crimmins reported that boardings were 43,000 that day on March 30th. There is an increase of 10% increase in the number of seats. Airlines are using larger planes. For the Met Council report, Deb Barber reported that FTA awarded a full funding grant agreement for the Gold Line BRT, and the B Line construction contract was signed, and construction will begin spring of 2023 with opening in 2024. And then Council held several listening sessions for the transportation policy plan. For the Suburban Transit Association, Gary Hansen reported that the motor vehicle sales tax receipts are underperforming and transit providers are making adjustments. Let's see. For business items, TAB approved 2 streamlined tip amendments. The first was for 3 project changes, And the second was for 3 projects added. Both of those came through TAC last month. And then they had information items on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act discretionary grants, presented by Todd Kalkarski of MnDOT and Jody Martins of SRF. They went through the potential changes for the 2024 regional solicitation. The items that they did discuss, overall they seemed okay with making few changes until the evaluation for 2026 solicitation. On criterion weighting, they discussed making a modest point increase to safety, acknowledged that additional discussion is needed to know the impact, and will continue discussion in the evaluation for 2026. For the maximum federal awards, TAB would like the technical committees to review the categories and provide feedback on whether changes are needed regarding inflation of project costs, and acknowledge that changing the maximums will affect the number of projects funded. So they do want the technical committees to discuss this. Breaking ties, TAB was fine using safety as the tiebreaker when determining funding of tied projects. They also suggesting allowing an applicant with 2 projects with the tied score that applicant could decide. And the BRT rule, this wasn't discussed, leaving that up to the technical committees. And then they also had a presentation on the 2050 Transportation Policy Plan goals, engagement themes, and the next steps.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the TAB report? Okay, then we will move into our agenda. We are putting things in a slightly different order today, so we're going to start with one information item, and then we have a bunch of business that we need to get through in the committee today, and then a couple more information items at the end. So this first information item will be presented by MAC staff, Eric and Dana. If you want to introduce yourselves, and we're going to shoot for about 20 minutes total with your presentation and Q&A. If we can stick to that so we can move to our business afterwards, that would be appreciated. So thank you and welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, committee. My name is Eric Gillis, Senior Airport Planner with the MAC. I oversee the planning program for MSP and our 6 relievers. I have Dana Nelson here.
I'm the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for MAC, so I help with moving the process forward and having a robust engagement process around the long-term plan.
And so today, the purpose of our update is an informational update of where we sit with the long-term plan with MSP. So we're going to go over a brief overview of the timeline, the stakeholder engagement activities Dana will talk about. We'll brief our long-term plan preferred alternative, and then just give a quick synopsis of next steps and how we plan to wrap up the long-term plan. So where we sit with the long-term plan in terms of project timeline, in the beginning we started with an existing conditions, exhaustive inventory of the airport. We went through an airfield capacity study as well as an aviation activity forecast. Flash forward 18 months, we had a pause of about 1.5 years due to COVID impacts. Since then, late in 2021, reinvigorating the long-term plan process, updating our aviation activity forecast to reflect COVID-related impacts, and since then, working through a facility requirement review to understand existing and future needs of the airfield, which then fed into a robust alternatives analysis process, went through a stakeholder engagement process, which Dana will talk about on the next slide. But in that process, now where we sit today is we have a preferred alternative, which you'll see in subsequent slides. We're working through a cost estimation process as well as a phasing in priority in terms of implementation strategy, and targeting to wrap up our long-term plan sometime before the end of this year, coming back to Met Council for a consistency determination.
Real quickly, we wanted to share some of our stakeholder engagement activities. We built a very robust system of stakeholder engagement around this process. We know that when it comes to comprehensive plans, especially airport comprehensive plans, the members of the public and our stakeholders are very often interested in it. And so what we did was a myriad of different methods that you see here on the slide. I won't talk about each one, but it involved convening technical groups, a stakeholder advisory panel, as well as public engagement throughout. So we held 3 different open houses for the public so far. We plan to hold 1 more once the draft plan is open for public comment, and then we will move through the process after that. So we just wanted to touch on that a little bit, let you know that these are some new things that we're doing, and they have been very valuable in hearing some of the feedback and informing some of the decisions that Eric will talk about with the preferred alternative.
Thanks, Dana. And so the synopsis of the preferred alternative, based on all of the stakeholder feedback we've attained through conversations with airlines, our fixed-based operator, which handles the smaller general aviation traffic, corporate traffic at MSP, as well as MAC internal workshops, so looking at the preferred alternative from an operational standpoint, as well as senior leadership to make sure we're aligning our goals and objectives with the plan with MAC overall goals and objectives, plus the external component, the stakeholder advisory panel meeting, public meetings, as well as other public meetings like our noise oversight committee, came up with the preferred alternative with an emphasis essentially on a terminal function, specifically to our Federal Inspection Service, or FIS facilities for short. That's where we process our international traffic at both Terminal 1 and Terminal 2. Our key takeaway there was that we need that facility both at Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 in the future. But like I said, emphasis on terminal expansion, gate capability, accommodating growth of airline demand, upgauging of aircraft. I think that was talked about earlier in the agenda here. With that, though, we need to acknowledge that the airfield is geographically constrained. So with the terminal expansion, we know we have impacts to what I would call airside needs, so the aprons and the taxiways relative to how the aircraft maneuver. And then geographically outside of that, the land side, so the vehicle access, the roadway access, we're landlocked essentially with the cemetery to the south, bodies of water and geographical constraints of roadways. So bearing all that in mind, we're being conscious of how we balance all 3 facets, airside, landside, and terminal in the preferred alternative. And so this is the preferred alternative. There's 16 high-level projects, lots of enabling projects to go into each of these. I won't delve into each of them specifically, but I want to point to a couple of highlighted projects. Before I do that, though, I want to highlight specifically the runway side of things. We, in that capacity analysis, have determined our existing runway quantity, our alignment, and runway length are all meeting our needs through 2040. And so really we are centered and focused on terminal expansion into the future. So with that in mind, I'll use your technology and hopefully it marks up okay. Project number 9 is where our existing concourse A and B are today. This is where we operate our smaller 50-seater aircraft. They fly to the Brainerds, the Grand Forkses of the world. We've heard industry-wide that there's a trend to that 50-seater aircraft going away and upgauging to a slightly larger aircraft with more seat capacity, relatively the same performance. So this project proposes to close our island concourse B and rework our concourse A to allow for additional hold room space and accommodate that slightly larger aircraft. Moving our way over to project number 5. So this is in Terminal 1, our green and gold parking ramps in front of Terminal 1 are reaching the end of their useful life. And so as a part of that project, the need to reconstruct them, we also acknowledge that we have a curbside and roadway congestion issue that we need to address. So in that, reconstruction of the green and gold ramp coming up with a new alignment to help alleviate some of that. And if you heard me talk about our FIS facilities, the existing FIS function is project number 2. That's where it is today. We need more space today and in the future, and the current spot where it sits in our concourse G area is too small. So in that project number 5, also relocating our FIS function into the green and gold ramp facilities, centralizing how we process our international passengers in Terminal 1, and then allowing us to have that growth that we need in the future. Projects 3 and 4 are concourses E and F. Both of those are also reaching the end of their useful life, and so in the process of reconstructing those over the next 20 years, also realigning them. Right now they're kind of in a V shape, and that's known to be congestive in that bowl area with only one way for aircraft to get in and out. So realigning them to be parallel with our other concourses allows for additional ingress and egress capability of our aircraft. Looking at projects 6 and 7, they're tied to each other in a sense, where project number 7 is where our existing fixed-based operator is today. Through this process and thinking about terminal expansion, the MAC determined that this space, in terms of highest and best use, is better suited for terminal expansion. sometime in the 20-year timeframe. And so project number 6 proposes to relocate our fixed-based operator to the north side of the airfield. A number of enabling projects need to occur to allow this to happen, specifically moving federal navigational aid facilities that are up in kind of that Project 6 area, specifically our primary radar. But those are some of the things that we're talking about in the long-term plan. Project number 1 is a little bit closer in terms of priorities. This would be an 11-gate expansion to the south of Terminal 2. In terms of timeline, this is more in that near term, within 5 years, design and desire, specifically to accommodate gate demand that we know we have today, as well as come up with enabling flex gates to allow for us to do things like reconstruct concourses E and F. Other things too, and came up in priorities and conversations with our airlines, projects 13, 14, and 15 address what I would call remain overnight aircraft parking, or RON parking for short. Some countries adding additional aircraft to their fleet that need space to park those aircraft. Delta has a similar story. And so as a part of this long-term plan, where can we park those aircraft when they're not in use? And then finally, project number 11 is acknowledging additional cargo growth. So this would be a small facility on the west side of our existing runway 1735 for processing, sorting of facilities of cargo, allowing for additional aircraft cargo parking as well. All in all, we're adding 12 gates total from what we have today, and I think that's it for the preferred alternative. In terms of next steps, we are working through an airfield simulation, so we have a baseline, and now we're running our preferred alternative through a simulation effort to understand possible conflicts with our preferred layout. We're working through project prioritization and cost estimates, as well as the formal report process, which, as Dana was talking about in the last Experience MSP event, we'll have a 60-day public comment period for the comprehensive report, which will start, I believe, at the end of June and last for 60 days. In terms of our stakeholder engagement steps, we're presenting here to you today, but we have other meetings coming up with our TAC planning and TAB meetings in the month of May. We also have our Experience MSP event coming up in July, and we'll host for public review comment period and coming back to you here before the end of the year for the consistency determination. And that's the end of our presentation. We can stand for any comments or questions.
Great, thank you for that presentation. Questions, starting there.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Joe McPherson with Anoka County. So you mentioned that the capacity you have on the runways right now is going to meet your needs until 2040? Okay. And then second question, it looks like adding the 12, so there's 12 additional gates going in. There must be a difference between the Terminal 1 and Terminal 2. Is that the two different size of planes? You mentioned the 50 passenger moving up to possibly a 75 passenger with the Terminal 1.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Committee, if I can answer your question, the upgauging of the aircraft specifically is tied to project number 9. There is other upgauging ongoing, non-related to the long-term plan specifically, and Concourse Charlie is the north concourse. We're looking at upgauging the size of those gates as well, but it's not really related to the long-term plan. But the upgauging is specifically tied to Terminal 1. Most of our gates at Terminal 2 are already where they need to be.
Okay, thanks.
Brian.
Thank you. Brian Isaacson, Ramsey County. I'm curious, this is all operational. Does it have an impact on the landside access? And can you speak a little bit to what you see relative to landside access for this plan?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Committee, thank you for that question as well. So as a part of this long-term plan process, Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 both have curbside and roadway congestion issues that we need to address. There will be spin-off preliminary design level projects that come after this long-term plan, which with that project number 1, in our Terminal 2 expansion, we will have more of that 20% design level for needs of our landside component. All of that is kind of tied to where the airlines are relative to Terminal 1 and Terminal 2, so the timing of that is unknown, but we know that we need to have additional studies to come up with more of a formalized layout of landside needs in front of both terminals.
Thanks.
Great. Any other, go ahead.
What's FIS stand for? I'm not familiar with that.
Madam Chair, Committee, that is the Federal Inspection Service facility, and that's where we process international traffic for arriving passengers.
Go ahead, Innocent.
Madam Chair. Innocent Taylor with the MPCA. Among the several projects that you have listed, do you know how many of them meet the requirement for environmental analysis?
And Madam Chair Committee, thank you for that question as well. We will actually be moving, we have high-level environmental considerations in the long-term plan report. In 2025, on our capital improvement program, we'll move forward with a full-blown environmental assessment. We'll review the environmental impacts comprehensively of the entire preferred alternative, and that will be in 2025.
Right, thank you.
All right, any further questions on this one? Not, thank you for presenting today, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Madam Chair Committee, thank you. Appreciate the time.
All right. Okay, moving on to committee reports. So Executive Committee did meet this morning. We ran through the agenda items for today and had a conversation about us meeting in person today and trying to maybe gauge where the committee would be at with respect to in-person versus virtual into the future. So we'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I think if Joe's willing and able, we'll follow up with an email to the committee after today with maybe a short survey, so you could please share your thoughts with us. Preference for in-person versus virtual, maybe doing some sort of, you know, is it quarterly? Is it a few times a year? Is it just as needed? You know, your thoughts and feelings on virtual versus in-person. There's some considerations when we think about this for, in particular, Met Council staff in terms of, you know, facility, you know, making sure the room is ready for us and the public notification so the public can participate in our meetings, and the inability right now to facilitate hybrid meetings. So it's either virtual or in person and not a hybrid. So we're interested in your thoughts, and we'll follow up with you all with an email after this meeting to further the conversation. Other than that, that is what I have from Executive Committee today, and I will turn it over to wherever Scott is for Planning Committee. Oh, hi, Scott.
Madam Chair, we do have a couple of
Oh, we do have items.
tip
You're right,
amendments.
tip amendments. How could I forget? I'm sorry, Scott. 1 second.
You want to do the tip amendments first?
Tip amendments
Yes,
first.
just
Yep.
stand up.
So go ahead, Joe, 2023-28.
Thank you, Chair. So we have two tip amendments, two tip amendment actions, as you say. And this first one is under the theme we've been having of new projects. And there are two actions here. One is very small and one is very large. The first one is MnDOT requesting addition of a post-project traffic study consultant service for $100,000. This is a follow-up to a reconstruction project on Minnesota 316 in Dakota County. In order to spend federal funding, a tip amendment would need to be added. And the next one is projects that you and TAB and the council have all approved as part of the regional solicitation in 2022, and they are going into the draft tip that you'll be seeing in the near future. But we have 17 projects attached that are all programmed for fiscal year 2024, and because fiscal year 2024 starts on July 1st, but the tip won't really be approved until about November 1st. We thought it was prudent to amend them all into the tip exactly as they're written in the draft 24 tip to avoid a situation where we get tip amendment requests that are maybe time sensitive and could put projects behind. So we're just going to put them all in all the 2024 projects into this tip as well. And with that, I would be here for questions.
Any questions on 2023-28?
Madam Chair, is that the 316 study, or is this the whole item?
It's the 316 study plus all the new projects that are being added from the.
Can I just ask Minette a quick question about the 316 project? Is this was this a planned follow-up, or is this because there are issues on the corridor?
Is there anyone from MnDOT who can answer that question today?
That's a very good question. I don't have the answer to that.
Okay, I was just curious. Not important, but we heard a lot about the project, and I was involved a little bit with it when it first started scoping at MnDOT, so I was just kind of curious.
Okay.
But it doesn't affect the action, so yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, I would entertain a motion on 2023-28.
Chair, I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Joe. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Anyone
opposed? That carries. And we will move to the next item, Joe.
So the next tip amendment is a Metro Transit fare collection and equipment expansion. This amendment is needed to increase the funds for fare collection equipment in state fiscal year 2023. Metro Transit is implementing a cubic fare collection system upgrade, which has costs well in excess of the 2023 TIP funds anticipated at the time that the TIP was created. And so also included here is the reduction in the project being reduced to accommodate this, and that is bus acquisition. And so that is a zero sum overall. So with that, I would stand for questions.
Any questions for Joe? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you, Adam. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Brian. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? That motion carries, and we can now move, Scott, thank you, to the Planning Subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Scott Mareck, Ramsey County, Chair of TAC Planning and the TPP Work Group update. So a couple things we're working on at TAC Planning and the TPP Work Group. We had a presentation about the functional classification update for the region. It was done by WSB and Associates. Something to be looking forward to in further TPP discussions will be looking at a recommendation from that functional classification study to get rid of the A minor and B minor classifications and just go to minor arterial classification, which would expand the project eligibility in the region, and also looking at potentially adding some additional principal arterials to the system. And then also one other thing to just keep in mind is that you may have seen in your email box, there's going to be a couple workshops in May to talk about goals for the 2050 TPP. So that invitation is for TAC and also TAB. So make sure that your TAB members know about that. I think there's one virtual session and one in-person session that's available. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Are there any questions for Scott on the Planning Subcommittee report? Okay, if not, thank you, and we will move on to the bulk of our action items today from funding and programming. Where's Michael?
Right here.
Michael, there we go.
All right.
You're supposed to sit over there, right?
I know, but they said I'm presenting, so I should sit up here. So
I have been told that it's hard to hear for the remote viewers, so if people can remember speaking on the mics, that would help there.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, the first item of business was the scope change for Hennepin County, Lowry Avenue. And so this is one item. We see these every once in a while where a certain element within a project is being completed by a different agency a following year. So in this case, Metro Transit is doing work a year after Hennepin County's project as part of the F-line BRT at this intersection, and thus Hennepin County is requesting to remove this scope from their project but maintain the federal dollar amount. And historically, the FMP has allowed for that as long as the improvements are constructed. So in this case, it's about $640,000, but maybe at some point this is a bigger discussion. So the recommendation was to approve this and allow the federal funding to stay with the county. And so I don't know if Chad or anybody from the county has anything to add to that.
Chad?
Just to follow up on that, we think this would be best for the community to construct this intersection in one project versus kind of piece it together with two projects. So less impact on the community. We will be, the county cost participating in elements in that Metro Transit project as well. And it will still, even with the reduction in scope and cost, it'll still be under the 80% cap. That's it.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there any other further questions on this item from committee members? I would just remind the committee that we have asked funding and programming to take up and review the scope change policy. when there's availability on the agenda to do so, hopefully soon. So that discussion about scope changes and federal funding will be happening in the next several months, I guess. So with that, if there are no further questions, I would entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make the motion to approve, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chad. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Joe. Is there any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. And Michael is going to walk us through the next items.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we had a handful of items at FMP. So we'll kind of skip through and hopefully hit all the high points on these items, and then I'll provide the high-level overview. And then, of course, we have staff here and a lot of members here that are on FMP that can add to the conversation today. So the first item was approval of the draft 2024 HSIP program for public comment. So there were just a few minor adjustments to that, but overall this was recommended with unanimous approval.
So we will pause here and take these each up one at a time. So this is in your packet 2023-21, the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Is there any discussion or questions for Michael on this item? Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, Madam Chair, thanks. So a quick question on the HSIP as we go through the criteria. There was a paragraph added in there that talks about explaining the methods the applicant used to choose the project, how it was selected over other potential projects, just to ensure that there's not a, I guess a short story is it's not a public or political pressure pushing the project through. What's the basis or what's the background on adding that language to the criteria here?
Yeah, Steve, the detail on that.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Joe. So that came from MnDOT and being on the scoring committee, I guess, the last several rounds. What MnDOT staff wanted to get out of that is the process used by the applicant, Anoka County, to say that this roundabout or this project was the highest safety need across there, or one of the highest safety needs across the system. What process did you come to get at that? Many of the applications did have that in there, how they chose that specific location or solution set. But others didn't, which the scoring committee then kind of was left to try and think through it themselves, and they thought that would be valuable for all applicants to put into the application. So that's where it comes from. Don't need a study or anything, but just a text explaining where the applicant came up with the project.
Madam Chair, just to follow up to that, I may make a recommendation here that you pull out part of that last sentence, the public or political pressure. A lot of times these projects do become a political pressure where there's safety issues, that type of thing. So depending on how someone reads that, it could be construed to a negative side of things. I think I understand the intent of MnDOT, but I would recommend pulling that, maybe the entirety of that sentence out of there and just leave the first two in there. I think you'd get to the point of what you're looking for there. Just a recommendation.
Okay, so maybe we want to get a motion on the table and then we could put the language for an amendment into the motion.
Yeah, so Madam Chair, I would approve the proposed changes to the HSIP criteria and application, with the exception of making a modification here. I'm not sure what page this would be, but under required material and special instructions, remove the last sentence of bullet point 4.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Elaine, do you have?
It's on page 8.
It's on page 8.
Page 8.
Okay, is everyone clear on the motion?
Jim's got a
Question,
comment.
Jim?
Yeah, Madam Chair, just curious if this is what Joe was speaking of is a scoring criteria, a qualification criteria, or just informational in the application? What's the intent of the
Steve, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair and Jim. So it's not a scoring measure as I read it, right? Joe, it's something that needs to be part of the application that's submitted. So it require, similar to qualifications for the regional association, I'd put on parallel with that.
Any further questions or discussion on this item? Okay. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And that motion carries. Thank you. Are moving on, Michael?
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. The next item is the criteria and weighting as part of the regional solicitation. So, as you know, this item was discussed before TAC, and it's been before funding and programming a couple times. We talked about perhaps doing nothing, maybe looking at a modest 100-point increase to the safety categories in each application. And then more recently, we said, well, if we really want to have an impact, why don't we look at adding 300 points? So overall, where we landed as a technical committee is we have this big study coming up for the 2026 solicitation. So understanding that there is some more weight on safety that TAB wants to see, let's go with a 100-point adjustment at this time. And that would be across all categories except for transit. So our committee did not think it would be important that all categories have the exact same points. And so we were fine just adding 100 points to all of the non-transit projects with more of a focus on safety. And there was, I think Lyndon had brought up the comment about the safety distribution within the roadway categories and making that more of a, using the current weighting on that. I think staff had proposed 50% PED, 50% roadway. So we adjusted that to mirror what the weighting is now. So that is not a 50-50, it's more heavily weighted towards roadways, which is how that category is set up.
Okay, are there any questions for Michael on this item? Go ahead, Joe.
Madam Chair, I think that looks good. I think you guys did a great job on that. The one question I had is when it comes to the bridges. So as we're all well aware, last year there was a lot of work done as far as what's eligible for bridges. Now that the off-system bridges are being somewhat included into this and considered for future solicitations, how did we end up at all of 100 points going, all of the 100 points going to the multimodal elements versus thinking about the condition of the bridges, the age of the bridges, the purpose of that subcategory? Could there be a 50-50 split where you put 50% towards those multimodal elements and 50% towards the condition and sufficiency rating on the bridge? Was that discussed at all?
I don't know that we got into that discussion at the technical level, but I think that's why we want to have the discussion here today because, yeah, obviously conditions and bridges are very important, so maybe that's something that you're making all the motions today, so.
No.
But yeah, no, I think that's a good discussion point.
Are there any other questions from committee members? If not, I would entertain a motion.
Madam.
Oh, go ahead, Lissa.
Chair, I'd make a motion to switch that safety point for the bridges to put 50 points in the bridge sufficiency rating. I'm not a structures person, so somebody tell me if that's not where that should go. But to move 50 points into, so the bridge sufficiency rating would go to 350 and the multimodal elements would go to 150. But put everything else, keep everything else the same.
Madam Chair, I'd second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second on the table. Is there any further discussion on this item? Is everyone clear on the motion? We have a motion to approve this item, adding the 100 points to safety-related criteria for all application categories except transit expansion and transit modernization. And in bridges, the points will be distributed between multimodal connections and bridge sufficiency. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, that motion carries, and we are moving on.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Next, the FMP, we just discussed the minimum and maximum awards. This was a pretty lengthy discussion, but I think the members were all over the place. Some people wanted, 3 categories all raised by a certain amount. We realized that construction costs and inflation over the past few years have been historic, and so maybe we make an adjustment based on inflation. And there was pushback from other members on that. So all good decisions are made by doing nothing when you have no consensus. So really what we did is just, we said, we'll leave it as is, and maybe this is better studied with 2026 solicitation.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Are there any questions for Michael on this item? Go ahead.
And I'm more confused when it comes to the next item, the ABRT stuff.
Okay.
On that, so, but what I see here is its max is 25 million.
That's not where we're at, right?
Got it.
And there was some other language in the next item. That's where I'm
We have
sure what's going
competing
on.
recommendations and motions we have to clean up, right?
Yeah, I think the language is, it's the 25 plus the 7 is that 32 max for BRT. That's what the wording is.
But then the next one out of F&P was 39.
And that, so that would be, it wouldn't change these amounts. It would be maybe 2 $7 million projects could be funded that were not ABRT.
Madam
So
Chair,
that's the difference.
did we skip something? Was there an action there for inflation or not? Or is there a,
No,
it's
so-
no action?
So no action, so we're just doing questions right
There's no
now.
dialogue about no action.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, right?
Yeah.
We're not gonna talk about doing nothing. Okay.
Would anyone like to put a motion on the table so we can further discussion, maybe?
Nope, all good.
Okay. Did you have a question, Adam?
I have a question, just a comment. Having heard the discussion, I think it makes sense because there's so many questions about this that we would be better suited to take more time next round rather than now. Having said that, it's really debate between should we fund many more projects and keep it small, or should we be more effective and, in my opinion, and keep them larger? And I say that having been on the operating end of filing the grants and doing the milestones and paying them and the reporting and all this. And so sometimes it's, from a federal program standpoint, a larger pot is better. Thanks.
I got a follow-up to that, Madam Chair. So do we know the amount of funding available, the next solicitation? Is it similar to the one we just did or lower?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair and Lyndon. So I think we'll be on the order of 250 million available. So if you remember 2 cycles ago, we were at 180 million. Last time we were at 355. And now that we got over the hump of kind of spending all that near-term money, now we'll settle in more at the 250. Plus, you know, that's the minimum, and plus any over-programming and other things. But so about a 40% increase of what we saw 2 cycles ago, I guess, is the get down to it.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Brian.
follow-up. Steve, you wouldn't happen to have at your capable fingertips the number of projects that changed from one to the next? Because, you know, to the point of dollars, it would also be interesting to know the numbers. If I remember right, the numbers were kind of roughly proportional to the increase in money. So if we went up.
Actual projects?
Yeah, the actual project, numbers of projects. So I'm going in a roundabout way, and I apologize, I'm not 100% caffeinated, but the whole idea being that, like, right now, this federal bill, larger than any other bill in history, has more competitive programs. There are so many competitive programs at the state and national level. And to now then say this, we should keep it at this level because we like having 150,000 projects as opposed to trying to dial in on more priorities, that's where I'm struggling, to be perfectly candid. And so I don't necessarily want to argue a percentage of inflation, but I think it should at least be something that gets to tab as a dialogue to say, we love that we went so deep in the list, but we went really deep in the list last time. And I'm a little worried that the list is getting shallow because we're going to see another increase in federal this time around. And there are other pots around as well.
Elaine, you want to jump?
Yeah, I can answer that. 2 cycles ago, we funded approximately 50 projects. It might be a couple more than that. Last year, it was 94. So that, yeah,
Right.
it almost doubled the number of projects.
And it was almost double the money. And so this time it's going to be, let's say, 50% more than 2018. It's a lot of projects. I'm just saying it's worth having a dialogue about about that issue.
There were some members that favored, raising safe routes to school to 2 million and maybe modernization to 10 million to have some parity with strategic capacity. So, I think maybe getting some better direction from TAC to move forward to TAB would be a good thing today. Again, we just didn't have consensus. It was just all over the place. So we didn't want to bring something forward that we didn't agree upon. So.
Go ahead, Lissa.
Chair, where my brain is going a little bit on this is I think it's a different conversation of increasing a little bit due to inflation versus shifting the region's thought process on funding fewer projects at a higher level. I mean, this region has chosen for many years to give how you call $10 million a little bit of money, but a little bit of money to a lot of projects. If there is a conversation, like if this item here is about inflation, we should talk about inflation. If this item here is about potentially shifting the thought process, which I'm not necessarily against, but shifting the thought process on trying to increase every single maximum in order to make a bigger impact on a smaller amount of projects, to me, those are two very different conversations. And so I don't know the origin of this. Is this specifically about inflation, or do we also want to talk about, I'm going to like little p, policy around trying to fund fewer, kind of to Adam's point, to trying to fund fewer projects, but a higher bang on those fewer projects. If that's the case, I do think that needs to be put into the study that's coming up, because that is a much more robust conversation that's needed. If we're talking about wanting to keep up with inflation for this round, then I think we choose a percentage, to make the numbers equal-ish and go with that. But to me, they're two very different camps, if you will.
Madam Chair, if I could just respond to that, because I would agree. I think the impetus for this was inflation, but when the conversation ended up going to, well, if we raise it for inflation, that means that there can't be more projects. So if we do nothing, there will be more projects. And I'd rather keep it where it is, or have that dialogue about whether we do more or not. And so if it makes sense to just raise for inflation this round and then have a broader discussion about where should these numbers be, that's fine with me. I just think that it needs more conversation. And so if the inspiration was because of inflation, which we know is significant, then we should do it.
And I'll just offer, thinking back to the TAB conversation on this, I think inflation is one of the factors. I think number of projects is a factor. And then there's also just kind of looking at it from a different perspective, which is which categories haven't been raised at all since 2014. So there are some categories that have been raised since 2014 and some that just haven't been touched. So that's a different way of looking at this. And go ahead, Elaine.
Yeah, TAB it's been a few cycles, had a separate action to add inflation to the projects that were selected. And that then reduced the number of projects selected because they only had so much money. So that was a separate discussion after they, when they were looking at the projects, it was first decided, do we add inflation to all the projects we're going to select? They made that decision. That then reduced the number of projects that they could select. So it does impact the number of projects selected in the end. Either you do it with changing the maximums or they make that decision later. If it's done here, it does not mean every project's going to get inflated. So if you have a project that's $1 million and you apply in the pedestrian facility, you're still only going to get $1 million. Versus if it was an inflation-adjusted decision later, you'd get more than $1 million. So the funding would change based on when you made that decision.
Go ahead, Brian.
That makes sense.
Madam Chair, I just want to be clear, I agree with Lissa. I don't think we're ready to say, let's shift the paradigm, but I think to the point of if you choose inflation, then you are choosing kind of a baby step toward that. And I think that there's some value in at least having that conversation. And there is history about how that's been done, and that can provide some guidance as to what CPI or whatever inflationary recommendation would be reasonable for this group for those years. And to the chair's point about maybe there are some that haven't been raised in what is now 10 years, so it's probably worth talking about that, but I don't know how we get from this to that. Is it a motion that's needed to say direct staff to figure out how to cook up a number for tab, or is it that it comes back to TAC?
Well, Madam Chair and Brian, yeah, I mean, we have inflationary adjustments back to 2022, 2020, 2014. So we had all these different options that show exactly, and I don't know if we have the slide up here that we can pull up, but so we looked through all of those various options, and you know, if you're a,
I think there is a slide
It's
that
on the
shows, you're
back.
talking about the value column, Steve?
The 2024 values and stuff.
Is that what you're talking about, Michael?
Yeah,
It's on the
it's in
action
the packet,
transfer.
right?
I don't think
What's in the
it's a
packet,
slide.
it's not in your.
Oh, is it a slide, Joe?
No, I don't think it's a
No.
slide, I'm sorry.
Oh,
It's in the packet, which we could bring up though, too.
okay.
yeah. So obviously, the further you go back with your inflationary adjustment, you're bumping these way up. Is that what you were getting at?
Madam Chair, so historically, what I recall, and I'll admit my memory is not as great as it has been in the past, but that MnDOT would be able to show you the projection, rather than looking backwards, they're looking forward based on a number of factors, and they provided information. And typically, it wasn't strictly, this is what we think the inflation rate is going to be in 2027. It was a recommended percentage to this body. Correct. Right, so it wasn't exactly like if they said it's gonna be 5% in 2027, it wasn't that MnDOT was saying that council, you should use 5%. It was that, 2-3% was, I don't recall it being
It
much
was
higher than that.
2% per year.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gina.
Madam Chair, I just have a question about that. So how was that applied? So didn't change the funding caps, it was something, once the projects were selected, you were allowed to get additional budget based on inflation, or, and then that ultimately, okay.
They applied a percentage to the project, yeah.
Yeah, that stopped a long time ago, though. Well, they just set the number.
Madam Chair, that stopped in 2014. So if you were funded in the first year, you'd get a slightly smaller percentage than if you were funded in the second year.
And if I could,
Go ahead, Brian.
if I recall, that coincided with some significant changes in the funding levels for particular categories of projects. Like that's when we went to 10, and that's when we went to 7, and some of the others. So like there was a relationship there of, let's just boost the number rather than continue to chase around inflation. But again, I may be wrong.
Yeah, that actually, the removal of inflation actually was a couple years before those increases started to occur. So I don't know if the removal of inflation was to get rid of the confusion and or to fund more projects.
I think, Madam Chair, it was a math issue, because I think they actually adjusted it every year. So every time they updated the tip or whatever, there would be a new number in your project. So I'm sure it's a complicated part to reconcile all the funding, constantly changing.
I don't think the federal shifted every year.
Oh, I thought mine did.
Oh. Carver County bonus, is that what that was?
That kind of like, as a Anoka.
Weird.
I was at Anoka
You guys
County.
know about the Carver County bonus? I didn't know about a Carver
Anoka County back then.
Sneaky devils.
So Madam Chair, this is a lot how the discussion went at FMP.
Yeah.
Are you having deja vu? Okay. Would anyone like to put a motion on the table?
Madam Chair, I'll take a stab at it here.
Okay.
Motion to approve to stay consistent with what the maximums are today, and further consider some additional conversations through F&P, back through TAC here in the upcoming months, so we're prepared for the 2026 solicitation. Could probably be worded a lot better than that. Elaine could probably do a lot better job than that, but.
I mean, for this action, it would be keeping them the same.
Yep.
And then adding it to the list of what will be studied for the 2026.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, is it time to offer an amendment, a friendly amendment, to add the minimums as well?
That's not friendly, Jim.
Oh, okay.
Just kidding.
I think we have to vote, or get a second at least, on the original motion first. So is everyone clear on the original motion is to follow funding and programming's recommendation, which is no change to the federal maximum award amount, and lean on further analysis and discussion for 2026. Joe?
Madam Chair, the minimum is included in the requested motion.
Okay.
It was never discussed, but was always a part of the motion.
Okay, so
I'll just revise my.
revise your motion. Perfect. Okay.
I'll take it on.
I'll second that.
Okay, so we have a motion that we have no change to the federal min and racs. Further conversation for 2026. Any further discussion on this item? Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And that carries. Go ahead, Michael, you're doing great.
All right, next item, mode splits. So this was discussed at our committee, but this is more of a policymaker discussion on, how much you want to fund in the different categories, roadways versus transit versus pedestrian. As you know, the last solicitation was pedestrian heavy. A lot of that was because of the different funding sources that came in and the amount of money. So at our level, we had no adjustments or recommendations from what exists today.
Okay, are there any questions for Michael on this item? There are no questions. I would entertain a motion. Brian?
So along the lines of what we talked about earlier, if there's some way for the council to provide where the ranges have been for the past few solicitations, like what categories have been where in the range, I think that'd be helpful for TAB to understand.
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, that's something we can put together. I mean, it's already done. I mean,
yeah,
2014 through 2020, we're at the midpoint, and then we shifted the midpoint, remember, to transit a little bit 2 cycles ago. And the last cycle, last November, relative to the midpoints you see on the screen, we were a little bit less for transit, because remember, we ran all transit projects and shifted much of that to the bike pad area. But yeah, we have those numbers and we can provide them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone like to make a motion?
So moved.
Second.
We got, all right, motion and a second. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? That carries.
Madam Chair, was that second from Lyndon?
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you.
Brian and Lyndon.
All right, Madam Chair, next item is the policies, qualifying criteria, and eligibility. So at F&P, we discussed, one of the big items that we discussed was the tiebreaker. There were a couple options, and option 2 here, which was recommended, is taking the highest scoring category from each application and using that as the tiebreaker. So what that equates to is for roadways, all of those projects, it's based on safety. And then for transit, Steve, you might have to help me out, what the highest.
Likely ridership for transit expansion.
Ridership for expansion. So everybody was on board with that. But again, it's very rare to get tied projects. It has happened in the past, but I think we have a good way of addressing it here. And then also it was mentioned that if by happenstance an agency has a tiebreaker of itself in the same category, that they can pick which one they want to move forward. And I'll buy a lottery ticket that day as well. So. And then we did have the BRT discussion, and staff may have to weigh on this a bit, but right now there's the 32 maximum, and the transit representatives from the group were fine moving that up to 39 million. I know that'll probably need some more discussion here today. And everything else is fairly straightforward. But Steve, I don't know if you want to weigh in on some of the BRT items here.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Thompson. So the one thing that we had a question too about the 39 million, kind of where that came from. And again, we brought different options to the Transit Technical Working Group and didn't have a consensus there. But right now there's 2 parts to the rule. One is ABRT, 25 million that you saw in the maximum award a few slides ago. That's proposed to remain the same, so still 25 million. So that leaves right now, which was 7 million for other bus rapid transit projects. That would be highway BRT, things like Gold Line, which was funded last time, Red Line, the future Purple Line. Those are the types of projects that would be encapsulated under other BRT. So that was $7 million. The recommendation coming from F&P is to bump that from 7 million of other BRT to 14 million. So you'd have up to two big projects that could be funded. And the rationale behind that is because we have more money available. Those caps were set 2 cycles ago based on $180 million available. Now we've got 250 plus. And so allowing for 2 projects we're calling other BRT, those more highway BRT projects to be funded. And that's the recommendation coming before you. But I'll say TAB, when we brought this to them over the last several months, has been confused by this rule because it takes 15 minutes to explain it in detail. And we have other slides that we're gonna bring to TAB, but it, you know, even people that were involved with this two cycles ago, it's tough to remember how we came up with this, why, and the rationale. And that's, I think, why we sputtered a little bit at the F&P to come up with a recommendation, right?
Yeah, I think, we deferred mainly to the transit representatives, and so Metro Transit and then the suburban rep were all kind of in agreement for this adjustment, so there wasn't a whole lot of discussion on this piece of it, so, other than that there's confusion around it.
Okay. So there's a lot of elements to this item, and maybe we'll take them one at a time. So let's start with the breaking ties part of this action item. Is there any further questions or discussions about the recommendation out of FMP on breaking ties? Go ahead, Adam.
Just a clarification, Madam Chair, that this is about those projects that are at the bottom of the list that are either in or out. It's not any 2 projects that are tied. It's just the ones that are at the bottom that are either be funded or not funded. And the idea is that you pick one, but you don't split it into pieces. That's the idea, right? Just pick one project or the other.
Yeah, you're talking specific to BRT?
To any project.
Yes.
The score would still be the score.
So if it's at the top of the list, it's not those 2 top projects. You don't have to split that tie.
Right.
We'd probably do it, but they'd probably both get funded.
Okay. Any further questions or discussion on breaking ties?
Yeah, question.
Go ahead,
So
Lyndon.
would you update the score so the final scores would be changed? Or would it be the score would be the score, it's just a discussion at the end?
Would the score be the score, but the projects would be lined up in rows according to which one had the higher tiebreaker score? That's the question. Elaine or Steve, which one?
Part of it is when TAB gets the decision of funding projects, they may decide to fund both tied. But it was when the money, the funding that was available was, do we want to fund both or not? And there was no rules that they could break a tie, so they were either deciding to fund them both or not fund either. And so this is when they can't decide to fund both of them or not. Then they would say, we'll fund one of them.
But the score that went through the scoring committee would still
stay
be the
the
same.
same.
It would be the same. I know TAB had said, well, send it back and rescore it. It's like, well, then how unfair would it be to the person that lost by 1 point? And so we thought this is the most fair, transparent. This is how it's going to be done up front, and we're taking any politics or anything out of it up front.
So they would have a tiebreaker, and then they would be listed in the order
Yep.
for the tiebreaker. So if it's the same applicant having the tie, TAB recommended having that applicant decide. Otherwise, the highest measure would determine that tiebreaker.
Yep.
Go ahead, Lissa.
Chair, I have too many attachments open and I'm trying to find the scores. I just want to make sure with our action earlier to move for the bridge category, to move 50 points into the bridge condition, wherever we put that, does that change for option 1 here that we're talking about right now? Does that change what the highest score is or the most percentage points of score? So option 1 says for B, bridge rehabilitation replacement, distance to nearest parallel bridge. Is that still where the most weight is, or does us switching 50 points change that? I think it's here nor there. I think this needs, I just want to make sure people know if it does shift that this needs to be updated, or if we need to amend that as part of a motion to change that. But I can't find all the scores fast enough.
Yeah, the infrastructure age and condition currently is the highest one.
So that's wrong in that memo then?
Oh.
No, it should be
No,
right.
that's bridge here.
Oh. So I'm on page 2 of the memo for this item. And under option 1, am I reading that wrong? It says that the tie is broken by where the highest amount of points are, and it says B, bridge rehabilitation, measure 1A, the distance to the nearest parallel bridge is where the most.
That's option 1. We went with option 2, which is just taking the highest.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, so 1 we did not move forward. It was option 2 that moved forward.
I'll clarify also, Alyssa, that if you decided to go with option one, what your suggested change wouldn't change. Oh, never mind. Yeah, it wouldn't change it at all because it would no longer be focused on the highest, it would be focused on those named items. Never mind.
So the options were the highest or the safety measure, and I think what came out was the highest. So that's not gonna change now.
Correct.
Okay, okay, sorry, thank you.
Highest weighted category.
Thank you. I was flipping these options as I was reading them.
Madam Chair, I would just say that that's a perfect example of why option 2 is superior to option 1.
Yeah, you don't have to keep redoing it.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions or discussion on tiebreakers? Is everyone clear on how ties are going to be broken? Okay, so then we'll move conversation to the BRT $32 million maximum. Let's just call it the BRT rule. Any questions or discussion on the recommendation coming out of F&P, which is to raise that to 30?
39.
Now I'm getting my numbers mixed up. 39, yep. 39. Okay, go ahead, Brian, and then Lyndon.
Can someone just clarify for me what's allowed under the 32 million? I'm a little confused.
Yeah, Joe, we had the other slides that were hidden that were, kind of showed this in more detail. This is a PDF, I guess, so we can't pull it up, but.
Like, is it new starts projects, or is it any BRT that's got federal funds in it, or is it ABRT 2 as well as exclusive BRT, or like?
Yeah, there's two branches here. One is the ABRT, so the next go around will be the F line, or FGH line. We've funded F and G the last 2 cycles. So though they cannot compete for the other funding. So that's 25 million for ABRT. The only types of projects that can compete for, which is now the remainder 14 million, would be the ones I named: purple line, red line, gold line, orange line, and any other future BRT. But ABRT is still capped at that 25 million. So it's just those named ones, 4 or 5 named ones.
Okay.
The only ones that could actually apply for that.
And that's up to 14 million of those, so it could be 3 projects if they're
smaller than 7.
Smaller ones, yeah.
30% times.
Lyndon was next, and then we'll come back to Gina.
Oh, I'm just, general question, I think I understand it now, so maybe it's not valid, but the overall timing of this, is this a critical decision to be made? The reason I ask that is the legislature right now obviously is debating a massive funding bill that would include an enormous amount of money into transit. So I know this, if this raised the amount in the mode, the transit mode, that would stay the same, right?
Correct. I don't think it's taken
just the
away
type
from
of
roadway.
project
Right.
that would get funded, so I guess I'm gonna shut up because I think I understand now what we're talking about. I thought we were raising the amount of money that's going into that category, the transit category.
Okay, go ahead, Gina.
Chair, I just wanted to illustrate why I think this was discussed as coming up at funding and programming is in the past 2 solicitations since this rule has been established, we have skipped some very high scoring projects because of the rule. So I think in the first year, there were 2 projects on Gold Line, top project in transit modernization and top project in transit expansion. And we had to skip the top scoring project in one of those categories. And then I think last year, we actually took funding out of transit and put it into other categories because one of the projects that was skipped was an Apple Valley pedestrian bridge to a red line project. And then another thing to point out, these projects are not always Metro Transit projects. They're often sponsored by local agencies. So I think Washington County was a sponsor. In relation to maybe the potential increased funding for Metro Transit, that might just help illustrate the issue for TAB.
Alyssa.
Chair, one question and then a comment. Is there a way TAB can separate these, or we can separate these into 2 separate actions? Because combining these is very confusing, and I think TAB is, if we're discussing them separately, I think they should be 2 separate actions. So I don't know if we can do that now, or if that should just go forward to TAB, but I just want to put that out there, because talking about the tiebreaker in this don't seem to go together as one action. But 2, generally I agree with that, although some of the history, and somebody else correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the history on this was to try to the BRT projects theoretically are the ones with some of the most ridership, and they're just gonna dominate the category no matter what, and it was, the limit was to be able to allow other projects to compete for money. And so I'm not necessarily against adding money that could go to BRT, but I want folks to know that that was the precipice behind this, was to allow smaller, quote unquote, but good projects to be able to compete against the behemoths. And I'm honestly kind of split down the middle on that, just because I tend to go, because the conversation to set this rule in the first place was months and months of pretty intense committees, and it was set for a very specific reason. And so that's where I'm somewhat leaning to just keeping it the way it is until there's another large conversation. But I'm also open to hearing people's perspective on that, because I also think it's odd that we're skipping good projects. So I'm giving you no feedback whatsoever and just putting it all out there.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I should add, to follow that up, the Transit Working Committee recommended no changes. So, which I think holds weight as well. So I just wanted to make sure to put that out there.
Thanks for that clarification. Adam?
So to further the conversation, the 25 million after a long and rigorous process was determined so that there wouldn't be over absorption of other funds that other projects could be awarded. But it's pretty clear in the last solicitation, maybe the one before, where there's 2 non-ABRT projects around the region that were, one ends up getting screened out. So I think it's fine changing that, and it doesn't mean there will be one every time. But I'd also suggest that there might be some applicants that apply to that category that could also apply to other categories, like pedestrian bikes might be one. And so if there's some counsel that staff can provide to applicants, if they're in the right category, that might be helpful as well. Thanks.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I was just looking for some clarification. So the maximum that we're talking about now will be 35 million, or 39 million, but it doesn't matter in the terms of the projects. It could be maybe 2 projects later or 3, depending on the amount that the cost of the project that they're applying for, right?
That's my understanding, yes. And isn't,
Yeah,
Go
Madam
ahead,
Chair.
Steve.
And just kind of doing the math on 250 million. So if the modal midpoint, was still that 30%, that'd be 75 million. And if you kind of play out the math, it would leave, based on the recommendation here, it would leave about 29 million for non-BRT projects, so local bus expansion or new service. And so that would be, the pot of money that would be between transit expansion and modernization for those non-BRT projects. So I think that's kind of the question, how much local versus BRT, what's the right mix there, is what we're maybe asking here.
Can you say those numbers again?
Well, I think there'd be about 29 million available for BRT projects in the competitive categories.
If it were all used.
Yeah, if you use,
30% midpoint? 30%.
Yeah, based on the midpoint, so it'd be, say if you went 14 million for highway BRT, 29 for local bus service, I'll call it, and then 25 million for ABRT, 7 million for TDM. That's the math, those are the 4 kind of components, I'd call them, of the transit money right now.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Madam Chair, to Lyndon's point, I think there's been a lot of good points, and I generally agree with Lissa's summary in terms of the history and why this occurred, and why I do think it's best we just keep the status quo for now, because it is a complicated issue. I think to Lyndon's point, there is a good chance that there's going to be significant new funding coming into the transit system, and some of the history behind this was obviously a lack of funding in transit and trying to find ways to fund these larger projects and new avenues to doing that. From an STA, suburban transit standpoint, I look at this last solicitation and I can look at it both ways in terms of I see why a quality project was skipped over, but I also see why a smaller project was allowed to receive funding for a different type of service that may not generate the ridership that a large BRT project is going to generate, but it was still a very viable project, and it was a microtransit project at the end of the day, which isn't gonna yield the ridership of a larger system. But to me, that was exactly why the rules were put in place, to allow that type of project to still be funded and not kind of essentially be gobbled up by a larger infrastructure project that we know is gonna score high based on ridership. So that's, I'm understanding of the logic as to why to raise it. I just think the confusion around it, there's not a consensus, and there's an unknown in terms of the funding that's gonna be coming down the pipeline for these types of projects from the legislature, is the reason why I wouldn't support the rule to increase to 39.
Can I ask Met Council a question? Did we ever consider just creating a BRT category instead of just holding the two categories you have and creating a rule no one understands?
Yeah, Madam Chair, that was under consideration, and, the group that met probably 10 times on said issue, and we didn't go that way because I think this was a shorter term fix to kind of squeeze in the rule to our existing structure than a new category. But you're bringing up a point that for the future evaluation, that's maybe an easier way to go about this than kind of the way we maneuvered into this one. Yeah.
And they may even look at LRT projects that are coming in under the modernization reconstruction, competing against the smaller modernization projects, what might be big and small projects, or could be a category.
Adam?
Madam Chair, I think that's a really great question, especially since the kind of projects has changed over these last 3 solicitations. So now we've got a bunch of transitway they're heading to maturity and they're part of the process, and so there's more of those. But on the regular bus route side, they're kind of diminishing in volume, and so maybe there's an opportunity as we reevaluate 2026 to think about a different focus for that type of service, because there's a lot of interest in microtransit, and so does that translate into programs and money that we want to pursue?
Lisa?
Chair, I would agree with that, and kind of in a new world order with COVID, and transit ridership likely isn't going to be the dominant thing as to how we're funding and why we're funding projects. We all know the region has to shift our thinking on the best way to serve people, to meet their needs, and so I think we should just keep the status quo here, and I think there's going to have to be a ton of effort around this piece to try to marry up where the region is going to go with transit service to how we are funding them. And ridership, I don't think, is going to be the dominant thing, or should be the dominant thing going forward, but that's a debate for another day.
Yeah, man, I agree with Liz. I think we are in a new paradigm, new normal in transit, and I think, these rules were created at a very different time, and as far as suburban providers go, we're certainly open to those discussions, and I think there does need to be great discussion around this and re-looking at this category overall, and we're open to those discussions. I just think, in a certain way, we're kind of trying to put a square peg in a round hole with just this one rule change. I think we need a broader look at the category overall, and we can address a lot of these issues for the 2026 solicitation.
All right, so I'm gonna go back a couple minutes when Lisa said this is complicated because these are all very different things all rolled into one motion, and I hope you're not mad, but I think it would be easier if we asked members to maybe break this up and separate into motions per topic area. So we've discussed 2 items. If we could go back to breaking ties before it goes too far into your memory banks, and is there anyone willing to make a motion regarding the breaking ties item, and we can vote on that before we move on?
Motion to move breaking ties as written.
With
Okay.
option 2.
So to clarify, the motion is to use the highest weighted scoring criteria as the tiebreaker. Okay? Any further discussion on that one? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, that carries, and then.
I apologize. Who seconded?
I did.
Okay.
Okay, and then I would like to pick up the BRT item. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion on the BRT item?
Chair, I'll make the motion to status quo. Keep the
Okay.
rule as is with the 25 set aside for ABRT, and then the 7 million top for an additional BRT project.
Okay, there's a motion on the table. Anyone who likes to second that?
Second.
Second by Matt. Okay, any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, great. Let's move on, Michael.
Madam Chair, I hate to be pedantic, but we also have to have one to do the rest of the policies, qualifying and eligibility. That's why they were together.
Right, are we moving on to that now?
To the next
Multi-use, we haven't discussed those ones yet.
Oh, my mistake. I thought you were trying to move on to the next
No,
slide.
I just, before memories go away, because those first two were complicated. So, okay, so Michael, let's talk about the next one, which is multi-use trails and facilities and elements of projects and where people are applying.
Okay, yeah, I mean, all applications include a letter, and this is more of the maintenance of snow removal, you know, not only for pedestrians, but roads, bikes, so this is pretty straightforward. There was a question, I think, from a tab member about applicants, if they could submit for the same element in 2 applications. So let's say you have a pedestrian category, you want to do a regional trail alongside a roadway that you're also proposing for modernization. And the modernization also has the road and the trail. And I think people do that right now. So the bottom line is, if you get funded in both projects, you're going to have to give up one of the projects. And so that's kind of how we approach the system now. So I don't know that we really need any changes for that. That's kind of the unwritten rule. So there is that flexibility, but if you're going to have to give one of those projects up if the element is in both projects.
Okay, so the discussion item is being able to apply in multiple categories but receive funding in only one of them. Any questions on that item? Go ahead.
I just want to clarify, at the technical committee, they recognized that this meant was worded so that was the same exact project. Applying in multiple categories was not allowed. Is what, when it says the same project elements in more than one. So you couldn't apply in spot mobility and modernization and traffic management technologies, the same application. But if it was a trail that was part of a roadway, that was allowed.
Correct.
Did you have to demonstrate independent utility so that if you didn't get the road but you got the trail?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions or discussion on
But
this?
Madam Chair,
Go
to
ahead,
follow
Linda.
up with that, you can apply to HSIP and spot mobility.
Yes, that's the only exception.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Can you clarify that? So you can get both HSIP and spot mobility?
You can apply for both.
You
You get
apply
one.
to both.
Okay, one or the other, okay. Go ahead, Brian.
So if I understand right, are these last 2 items multi-use trails and not applying to different categories? Or is this under the bucket of no change, so no action?
Do we need an action?
4th bullet is no change. 3rd bullet is change. So currently, the multi-use trails, there is a requirement that they provide a letter that they will remove snow and ice throughout the year. It is not included in the roadway projects that have trails on them. And this change would, you would have to add a letter for the roadway projects that you will clear any trail that you've included in that project.
Okay, so the only change is that this letter is required for bike and ped elements that are part of a roadway project. It's already required when you apply multi-use trails or ped facilities. Okay,
And I would say that if, assuming you keep that, the motion would be just the motion. You wouldn't have to make any changes to the motion because it's already embedded in the motion.
okay. Is that clear as mud to everybody?
But we've been taking, Madam Chair, we've been taking pieces of the, what is an
Of the
overall motion.
Yeah, so it
right?
doesn't, so
If I could take a shot at moving this
ahead.
so that we can progress.
Yep.
So I'll say, I'll move the multi-use trails piece as written for approval.
Second.
okay, and so to be clear for the committee who has to vote on this now, the only change is that we're requiring this letter from the operator of the facility confirming snow and ice year-round on these facilities when it's part of a roadway project like we already do in other categories. Any further questions? Go ahead, Craig.
Who's going to be the snowplow police?
Yeah, right.
The public.
We'll go there.
I mean, I'm serious. I mean, we're creating busy work. I mean, our goal was to reduce the amount of work these things are. And yes, it's a simplified letter, but it's a letter, you know. It's one more step we have to do in these applications. And again, following up, you know, a lot of times, whoever is the applicant has agreements, like the counties have agreements with cities to do the snow plowing. You know, the city can do the snow plowing. We may be receiving the funds, but if they don't do the snow plowing, what can we do?
Brian?
Yeah, I don't disagree, Craig. But I think the same is true across the board of everything that the council funds. And I think we've seen look backs at projects and what we thought got constructed. And if I remember right, it was around 10% of the things that we thought we funded were different that actually in the field. And I think, to me, the question would be, is that a hill we want to die on relative to this? We put a letter out there and let's say 6 years from now, someone says, you know, I was out there on a trail on County Road, whatever, and it seemed like the trail wasn't plowed. I think your answer is going to be, we have agreements. Maybe that was a bad day. Maybe the plow driver was sick. I don't know. But generally speaking, we remove snow from trails. Like, is that enough? I suppose you could raise it at a tab level, and say it's not a direct line to whether we clear the trails. But I think we have agreements that.
They're not gonna take the federal funds away?
That's my point, yeah.
Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, and I guess my point is, can it just simply be a checkbox or whatever it is? You know, we already have a checkbox that we're agreeing to maintain certain things.
That's a fair point.
Instead of a separate letter in the application.
Sounds like an amendment.
I'd take that.
At the risk of showing how out of practice I am, who seconded this? One of you guys over there?
I did.
Oh, you did? Gotcha.
Okay. Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Sorry, thanks, Chair. So I think that, try to think about how to state this. So given, I think, I hear what you're saying, and these things are known requirements, and I think some of it has grown out of, you know, past consideration for that maintenance work not being done, or there being some, I think, murky gray areas where in the past perhaps there have been facilities funded that have not then been considered officially transportation facilities, and so that can then kind of be scooted into, well, that's a recreational park facility, and so we don't maintain that in the winter. And so I think if there's a concurrence based on what these funds and the requirements of these funds is that this is a transportation facility, it needs to be maintained per the ADA, per it being a reliable and predictable connection that is always available, then I think we can probably get to a place of generally supporting not having to have additional busy work, like you said, because we don't want to make this cumbersome. We just want people to do what they're supposed to do, right? So I think I'm speaking from the PED side of things. I think I'm okay with that because it's, again, ADA requires a certain level of snow and ice maintenance too. And I know we're kind of in this evolution space right now, a lot of our agencies with getting there, but I think we've also made a lot of progress too, which is great. So I think that's all I have to say about it. Thanks.
Go ahead, Eileen.
And this might affect whether they get the points with the multimodal. I mean, if you're putting the trail and if you don't require the letter and it's not there, then you wouldn't get the points necessarily for the multimodal use being available. I mean, that could be tied to that.
Chair.
Go ahead, Brian.
You know, I appreciate both comments, and Mackenzie, I appreciate you bringing up the ADA angle, and that's important. And so along the lines of what Craig was suggesting, I mean, if it is a box, can we expand the words in the box to say what the expectation is? And because I think, you know, to that point, maintenance has been a little weird. I think that there are some folks who've maintained that they groom the trail rather than plow it, and maybe that's acceptable. I don't know whether it's acceptable from an ADA standpoint or not, but I take your point. And so if we had some agreement on what that language should be, I mean, I agree the letter is a little silly. Then we start talking about whether it comes from staff or whether it comes from an elected official, whether we need a resolution, and I'll say, like, now we're down the rabbit hole, right? And so if we can find a way for that to be a box, but for it to reflect what the expectation is, that's where I'd like to go.
Yeah, and I'd just like to, Madam Chair, I'd just like to mention that not all trails or ped bike facilities built with road projects are transportation facilities. They could be a little connection to a local facility. I mean, they might eventually get to you where you want to go, but not always. Whereas the separate categories for the big trails we build, I would say, yeah, because they are on the RBTN network. That's not necessarily the case for the ones built with roadway projects. They can be recreational trails. Doesn't say in there that it has to be an RBTN alongside your roadway. So there's a difference in the types of trails we build with the different funding categories.
But then I would add, then that would be reflected in your response to the multimodal measure of whether it's going to be transportation or not.
Correct.
Yeah.
But you still get some points even if you put a local trail in with a road project.
Okay, Lissa.
Two things. One, to clarify, if we're talking about moving to a checkbox versus a letter, would we be making that recommendation for also the bike ped that would move to the checkbox too with, to Brian's point, a more robust, whatever that box says, what the actual expectation is? Is it for everything, or would it still be, a letter still be required for the bike ped category? But I also want to say I don't agree with us kind of mincing words with what if transportation and recreation are two separate things. If somebody's on a trail, whether they're doing it for recreation or an errand or to work or to walk their dog, it is transportation. And I think to Mackenzie's point, these federal funds are funding transportation purpose. And I think the history on this is if we were requiring something on a trail or a sidewalk to be plowed in one category, why weren't we requiring that for a trail or a sidewalk in a different category? And so I don't see how the transportation is somebody moving to one place to another. The purpose behind that, I don't think is this group's job to dictate the difference and then whether or not it needs to be maintained in the winter.
Jim.
Madam Chair, I'll widen the discussion just a bit further and just say that a lot of elements in other projects are outdoor facilities such as transit stops, et cetera, and there's no requirement for, any kind of statement letter, checkbox, what have you. I think further than a checkbox, a simple statement that it would be, the facility would be maintained year-round is sufficient.
That is actually built into the language, yet people have disputed that it applies to trails and bikes for reasons.
I had a couple things, but to them, right now, we do have language, they have to, you do to check off that your project's ADA accessible.
Yeah.
But the one thing I was going to add for this one, if you do have a checkbox, what that means then is the applicant is saying they will maintain it. So if it is a county project expecting from the city, that's where the letter was the difference, was to say who would actually be maintaining it. If you just have a check, then it is going to be the applicant.
But it can still be viewed as the applicant via agreement with their local partner, right? So those agreements don't need to be part of.
But if you don't have an agreement, it is putting it on the applicant as a county. Unless, like I said, unless you had a fill in the blank, who's responsible. But then if it's someone else, they would have to provide some agreement to that.
Adam?
Madam Chair, I would agree with what you just said, is that it's tacitly implied that whoever the roadway owner is going to maintain it and leave it at that.
The how is for them to figure out, right?
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else on this item? Brian left, and I was going to ask him if he wanted to keep his motion as is.
He's had enough.
He said he would accept Craig's friendly, I thought.
Yeah.
Any other further discussion on this item?
I have a question.
Let's go ahead.
Bill Dermody, City of St. Paul. I'm a little concerned about the issue that Lyndon raised. Would we possibly end up in a situation where a local type of trail is part of the project and they want to build it, but they can't maintain it at this point and they hope to in the future? Would that make an entire project ineligible? Are we discouraging small segments of trail from being put in, which would be good in the overall long term because of the difficulties of maintaining a small stretch for now, whereas in the longer run it would be maintainable. That's a question to the group, I guess.
Anyone have additional thoughts? Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Thanks, Chair. So I think that point taken on local connections. I don't think those are any less part of the transportation system per Lissa's points that were being made. And as far as if they are expected to be pedestrian used facilities, there is an ADA requirement that they be maintained year round to an accessibility standard. And so, you know, if internal, you know that it's not going to be a maintenance priority for your agency in the near term, then that really comes back on you as you accepting that liability to not address that. I mean, we all have our different, you know, tiers of priorities and how we're handling these things for different infrastructure. So I think that that's where that comes back is, you know, if you then have an agreement that your agency works out as the applicant to maintain that, or you have kind of your plan, or you're accepting that liability, then that is what that is. But my comments certainly aren't applicable just to the RBTN network or others. It's really anything that is to be used by people walking and biking to transport themselves, whatever that purpose may be.
And so is there a scenario where if there's a local segment that is part of a larger project in the future that an agency doesn't want to maintain in the winter, that agency takes the responsibility of closing that facility during the winter months and putting up a detour as another option to plowing? I think we're engineers here, and we are really good at getting into the details.
Madam Chair, I apologize, I
you're
had to
back.
step out. Yeah, and you guys didn't solve it while I stepped out? I mean, I was gone for like 5, come on, you guys are solvers, come on, get it done. You know, the only thing I'm struggling with is like, I think we're losing sight of the ADA component here, and that I think we want to say we don't want to maintain it, or I'm not the universal we, but somebody is in a we that's saying we don't want to maintain these things in the winter, and I understand why, but like the notion of you have a thing and that we're not going to maintain it means, to Jenny's point, now we've got to have something else. And I don't think that when folks say, I don't want to maintain it, they're thinking about the next step of, I have a thing and now I need to provide something else. It's like TPAR, right? During construction, you can't just say, well, you're a pedestrian, you can go screw because I'm working here and good luck. Like, we have to do things in our projects. And so on some level, that element needs to be part of this dialogue. If we're gonna say it's not transportation or whatever, it's something that we build, and there is an expectation from an ADA perspective that we do something else if we're not gonna maintain it.
Joe?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thanks. I think with all the discussion here today, I think the one thing we gotta keep in mind too is each agency has their own, like Mackenzie mentioned, you have your own priorities that you build. And so depending on the size of the agency, the number of staff they have, you know, we work with our local partners such as Fridley, and depending on when they come in and they organize their maintenance forces on, whether it's trails or sidewalks, what have you, we really rely on them because it's with their local community members. Some cities, they don't even plow their sidewalks. They rely on I think we saw it in the paper earlier this year. There are cities where, yeah, they're considering hiring contractors to come in for multi-million dollars every winter. So I think it's important that, I think the projects are getting at the fact that roadway projects are including these multimodal elements, and that's the key. But I think the maintenance thing, that's a bigger item. That's an operational thing that, yes, it's included in our ADA plans. We have ADA transition plans that we all should have adopted by now as agencies, so we've got that built into those. I'm more on the side of let's put a checkbox on that form, and each agency can kind of determine how they're maintaining it, and liability lies with that agency. Otherwise, if we get too specific with the letter and saying, yes, we'll maintain it on a 48-hour basis, our local partners might not be able to fulfill that. I'll put Jim on the spot, but I don't know, Jim, do you guys get out there 48 hours right after a storm?
Well, Madam Chair is putting me on the spot. Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Nicely done.
There we go.
So, but, but it's not without challenges.
On the federal projects, right?
On the federal projects.
Prioritize those routes.
I'm gonna go to Alyssa and then back to Brian.
Chair, part of what I think about in this is the amount of strategy that goes into what projects we are gonna put forward is a lot. And there are some cities within Washington County or townships that we know aren't going to maintain in the winter for us. So we don't pitch projects for that area. Does that mean a project won't get done? Not necessarily, it just won't get into this pool for an application. So I wanna be a little bit, I don't think it's a whole host, parts of projects or that project won't get done. They just won't apply for this pool of funding. They will apply for a different project for this pool of funding and fill that gap in their CIP elsewhere. I know it's not that easy, but generally, this is just one piece of the overall strategy on trying to figure out what's going to compete best. And if you have an entity that's not gonna do the maintenance, then we for Washington County, we know we're not applying for anything with a pet facility in that community, and it is what it is. I think if we are saying that ADA, this money has to comply with ADA, and therefore it has to be maintained in the winter, I don't know how we get away from not having this checkbox at a roadway category.
So if we bring this up a few thousand feet, we're suggesting a checkbox that affirms a commitment to maintaining a facility without asking you to define how, who, or level of service. It's simply a commitment. Brian?
Yeah.
Can you reiterate your motion?
I think you just did it for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, anything else you want to add?
No, just the last thing is that I think as a group of people, we continue to maintain that when we build road projects, we have multimodal elements in them. And we talk about that as part of how we think about funding ranges and all of those things. And if we're going to continue to assert that, we need to do this piece too.
Well, same with transit.
I'm not arguing transit. I'm just saying, if we're gonna wave that flag, we wave it the whole way around. We don't get to say we provide multimodal elements, but only when it's warm. We need to show up. And however that looks, I agree, it is a wickedly complicated thing, and I'll say it is a mixed bag in terms of its effectiveness, but there's at least a process. And Minneapolis is a great example. They got a process. Does it work 100% of the time? No. That's true for all of us, I'd say.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? I was gonna call the vote much more quickly, just in case, but, okay, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right.
All right, Madam Chair, did that motion include agencies have to plow their roadways as well? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Michael, I told you about my.
I know. Just giving you a hard time.
My in-person meeting in downtown Minneapolis.
This came up and staff had no concerns that anybody wouldn't plow roadways, only that they wouldn't plow bikeways and sidewalks.
All right, Madam Chair, last couple items here. So scoring measures guidance. So with the transit ridership, so shifting to the 22 counts from 2019, as you know, we used 2019 because of the COVID period. Also a clarification that Safe Routes to School plan does not have to be MnDOT sponsored, which I think provides more flexibility to locals. And then lastly, allowing bridge rehab replacement projects on collectors, minor collector and above in the urban areas, or on a major collector and above in rural areas. So the recommendation, as you can see here, was the approval of these measures for the 2024 solicitation.
Okay, so we have 3 individual items again, and I will see what the group's preference is on taking these up individually or as a group here. Is there any questions for Michael on these items? Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. One thing we talked about at TAC Executive was the third bullet point, the bridge, opening up that eligibility. There's also a measure, and Carver County staff had alerted to us after funding and programming. One of the measures in the bridge application category is the length of the diversion route. If the bridge were to close, so a longer diversion route, more valuable that bridge is on our system. Right now, it says that diversion has to be on a A minor or principal arterial. And so with this change to the eligibility, I think we'd also change that specific measure that you could cross the river or whatever barrier on an equal or higher level functional class. So that was one thing that was brought up since funding and programming that we'd prefer to get into the motion if we can here.
When you say equal or higher, so if it's a higher one, it couldn't go to a lower crossing?
Well, I would say anything that's federal aid eligible. Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll clarify that.
Any questions on any of these items or discussion? If not, I would entertain a motion. We'll just assume these are going to be bundled together as they came forward from FMP.
Chair, just a question for Steve. Is that going to cause any problems with principal arterials? Or logical detours would be on minor arterials?
Yeah. So, Madam Chair, Bill, so good question. So you're asking if you have a non-freeway principal arterial bridge and you're diverting and you take it on a major collector, is that a kind of system-wide issue because now you got freight or something moving on maybe a local bridge, more of a local bridge? Is that the question?
No, kind of the inverse actually. If it's got to be at the same level or higher, what if there isn't another principal arterial nearby, and minor arterials carry that traffic just fine?
That was the same point. I think that was, he was going to reword that, so he didn't say that.
I may have misunderstood.
Yeah, I think it would be any federal aid eligible roadway could be the diversion route. So that would be what's shown on the screen. Minor collector and above in urban areas, major collector in the rural areas or above.
Got it, thank you.
Okay. Any further questions?
So, Madam Chair, I'd move this item in its entirety with the one addition to the change to the bridge measure as described previously. I'm not sure I can repeat it exactly, but we'll have the language ready for tab.
Perfect. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Brian. Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? That carries. Thank you. And now we are at 2023-27. So recommendation to release the package for public review and comment. Any questions or discussion on this item?
I'll move the item.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone second?
Second.
Thank you, Innocent. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, that carries. All right, and that concludes the business today. We have 2 additional information items. It's about 10:50. We are scheduled until 11 o'clock. So we will start with our information items. I will be leaving shortly because I have an in-person meeting in downtown Minneapolis soon, so I'll turn the chair over to Brian. But I will invite up Steve to talk about the Protect program of the group.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Again, this is an info item. We've got 2 of them. We'll leave some time for Charles here for the second one, so maybe try and go through this fairly quickly. So this is one of the new federal funding sources that came with IIJA was called Protect. And there's 2 parts to Protect. One is formula funds that go to the state, and that's what we're talking about today. The second part, Joe sent an email out. There is a federal discretionary NOFO that was just released that you can apply to the US DOT across the country from a federal competitive standpoint. So today we're going to talk the formula funds that are coming to the state. Back in February, MnDOT decided to give 30% of those those funds that are coming to the state of Minnesota to the ATPs across the state. And that's part of the reason why we've got money that we have to spend now. They did take some of the earlier year monies, but we do have early year money that we just found out about, so we're trying to develop a process for how to use it both kind of in three different buckets here. How to use 24 to 27, how to incorporate it into the next solicitation that we're about to release, and then how to use it kind of in the future. So those three timeframes. One of the unique parts about Protect, at least the state formula funds, is that you cannot put it on an entire project. It's very different than like carbon reduction or STP or CMAQ, where the entire project is federally eligible. These are specific elements within projects, and we've identified a few of those here on the screen in looking back at the 100 or so projects when we're trying to put Protect money on past projects. So storm sewer, ponding, erosion, retaining walls were some of the project elements that we worked with MnDOT central office on identifying what those were. So here's how much money is available. Again, it's front-loaded in the first few years as MnDOT took the 22 and 23 money, gave us that back in later years. So what we talked about at F&P now 2 meetings ago, is this got tabled here last month at TAC, was to use the 2024 money. It's already going into the TIP, and you saw that with the Streamlined TIP amendment today. We put those eligible project elements, so we did a mix of usually STP and Protect money on some of the projects that you selected previously for the solicitation. But today really we want to talk about 25 through 27. So no action needed on those 24 funds. You'll see those in the draft TIP. We looked at the tab policies, which talked about bringing a variety of options to the group for how to use additional funds. And so this is linked here. I talked about that at F&P. So we put together 3 different options that we'll bring to tab, and then as needed, we'll bring back next month as an action item. The first option is to use on existing projects. Again, our next solicitation is 20 and 29, so you could use it on existing projects, thereby kind of paying down over programming. And you can see the entire regional solicitation is the first row is how much we're over programmed by year. We did quite a bit of over programming this last cycle. And you can see how we do the same process as we did for 2024. Put it on existing projects we've already selected, thereby paying down over programming. Option 2, second option that we're bringing to you, is to use a mix of existing projects and new projects. So we take some of that Protect money in the earlier years and put it on the past funded projects through the solicitation. And we look at, then we did look at the next unfunded project on each of the lists. So we went across all the application categories and said, we found 3 projects out of the 12 application categories that had Protect eligible elements. And so those are shown on the screen. Since we do not have additional money in those earlier years, what we're saying here is that if you did want to do option 2, the logical or the only viable option would be that Carver County project. And that's because they are, with that project, raising the roadway out of the floodplain and building a bridge. So the entire project as requested would be eligible for Protect. So we wouldn't have to match it with STP dollars with Protect. And here's how that would lay out. Again, a mixture of using on existing projects plus new projects for primarily 26 and 27 funds. And then moving forward, future solicitations will better adapt to kind of integrate it into our processes. Option 3 was to push it into a future solicitation. That's another one in the tab policy. We don't think that's, again, a viable option because we can't mix and match other funding in those earlier years because we just don't have it. We've already over-programmed. So that's a quick 5-minute overview. Again, we'll dig into more if this comes as an action item next month to you, but more so just wanted to explain, here's a new funding source, here's kind of our general approach to decision-making, and do you have questions on that?
Lisa?
2 things. One is minor, but want to bring it up. The policy, so slide 6, is about the reallocation. To me, this is not reallocating money. This is talking about new money. So I'm not quite sure why this policy is the one that's in here, unless there's a definition of reallocation. But this is new money. And so why we're applying or talking about applying a reallocation policy seems strange to me. But maybe that makes sense to somebody else.
I think it covers all new federal funding that needs to be allocated.
Right.
I'll double check though, but I think that's
We
what's
can-
in the
we can-
policies for all.
Okay. But for option 2, I disagree with the assessment that, I mean, I'm talking for Washington County, obviously, of just looking at the application. The application wasn't written for protect money. It was written to meet the needs of the regional solicitation. I agree that the Carver County project very obviously, clearly is a protect project. The 19A project, I would argue and could provide the documentation that more than just the storm sewer line would qualify for this money. And so I have a hard time going with the quote-unquote obvious project without having the ability to give all 3 of the projects the opportunity to submit a memo or something to say what out of the information provided, basically what we're gonna have the next solicitation to do is like write the paragraph and say what qualifies. All 3 of these projects should do that. So TAB, if they're gonna pick the Carver County project, they should know, is that the obvious one or what's on the table? And how then did this come into play that it is the Carver County project because it is the most obvious one? You know what I mean? Like, where was the decision making there for the, I know no decision has been made, this is for discussion. But I want to talk about making sure we're not putting TAB in a place of just choosing the most obvious project and making sure every project that's in consideration for this money at least is assessed at the exact same level.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Madam Chair and Alyssa. So we certainly can do that outreach. And looking at the last 2 columns there, eligible costs versus total project request. The tough part is on some of the other projects, we're funding at a very low percent of what they're requesting. So I'm not gonna use their example, I'll just say the Hennepin County project, the eligible costs are $177,000, but what they asked for was $1.6 million. So we're either give them a very small amount, which some applicants may take, probably not that small. But you don't have other funds to match with those, and that's really the crux of the issue with why we came up with the options that we did.
And Chair, where I'm disagreeing with you is that the eligible costs are wrong. That you need to give each of the 3 projects the same opportunity to say, hey, based off your justification of what's in this regional solicitation application would qualify. Because the rationale, I understand that rationale, but then if I come to you and say, actually, it's $7 million or $6 million of the 7, then that's a completely different story. And I think that also then sets us up very differently on slide 9 of, are there 3 projects here? I have no idea what the Hennepin County project, the details are, but if we're also saying that a big chunk of that then we, I think, need a little bit more evaluation to show why the Carver County is the one that gets the money. I'm trying to be careful here to try to help, Lyndon along, but I also need to do me here. But that also puts into play some of that over-programming on existing projects. I think it completely changes what we're talking about here if you give the projects the opportunity to actually show what's eligible for Protect as opposed to kind of cherry-picking from an existing application that wasn't written for Protect funding.
Agree, we can do that, yes. Yep.
Yeah, I guess follow-up to that, Madam Chair. I agree totally with what Alyssa's saying. That is a fair approach given the way the original projects were submitted. Now, Steve, is there a way that if Washington County had 6 million eligible for 5 instead of 825, is there enough money available from the savings and over-programming to fund that one as well? Seemed like under option 1, we saved 15.5 million, right, total? In over-programming? Yeah. But here you're assigning, what is it?
Let's go back to this slide.
11. Is there another 4 or 5 million available that could potentially be added to this?
There is, so Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair and members, there is, if you look at the 2025 column as it's shown right now, there's another 5 million, 5.1 million, so yes.
So there's an opportunity to do both.
We could, yeah, I think that's an option. We got to be cognizant of kind of modal balance and some of those issues too. And I think that's what we'd have to keep an eye to.
So Chair, I would prefer this go to tab with either, if there's not enough time to get the counties to be, the 3 projects to be able to respond, I would prefer this to go with a question mark in the eligible, something in here to note that these numbers are going to change. And so I'm open to what that looks like, but I would prefer slide 8 to not be so definitive on what the eligible costs are, to say we're asking each of the 3 projects to demonstrate what is eligible.
Steve, you want to talk about process?
Yeah, that's a fair request, and I think we would make this more high level than we have here with the specific projects. We would say, do you want to do a mix of existing and new projects, and maybe not get into the projects? We assume that the technical people would say, well, what projects are available? You know, that's the obvious next question. But I think we would bring this to a higher level in 2 weeks' time.
And then it will come through FMP in
May.
and TAC in June? Okay. I don't know who was first.
Oh, he was first.
Okay, Craig.
Just to go back what Alyssa brought up at the beginning, the reallocation policy. The last sentence in the reallocation policy says this process does not address how to distribute new federal dollars available through larger specific programs. TAB will make that decision, so.
TAB has the authority to make that. My follow-up, Madam Chair, was, going back to the regional solicitation, the big one we just did, ton of work, thanks to everybody, awesome job. We had the carbon money coming new, right, the on-system bridge money, we had all these new programs. Protect was around, we just didn't know we weren't quite ready to allocate it. My pitch to my project is if that money was on the table at the time, this project probably would have got funded.
All right. Chad?
Just quick on option 3 there, it says that you don't believe that pushing that to what is a viable option because it can only be used on specific project elements, but I think the Carver County project shows it can be used for a project, so I see a little discrepancy there saying it's likely not possible. Maybe that was a one-time project, but there might be other projects out there now that, people would know the rules. So maybe that statement just needs to change. I think it's program. By saying that, it contradicted, I think, the previous slide.
Sure. Yeah, I think in the future, if people had a mind to what the eligibility is, maybe there would be more projects. We found one of 150 or so that we looked at that were, but people weren't thinking in that mindset when they submitted it either. So fair point.
I want access to Carver County's Magic 8 Ball, because you guys called this one, so.
Yeah, well done.
And it's got to be also eligible for the earlier funding.
Yes.
For the solicitation.
That was a statement.
27?
Yeah.
Brian?
Just time check.
Time check. Okay. So this is going forward as information only, and we'll come back through these committees for action. So if you have additional questions, jot those down, keep those handy, and ask those as it comes through the process again. And Charles, you're up.
What a treat to be last on a very busy day with start time after the end time of the meeting. I'll be really quick, Madam Chair. So wanted to give this group just an update on the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan modification that is moving forward that incorporates new council policy regarding how transitways advance. Briefly, transitways are important pieces of infrastructure in the region. They also have experienced some setbacks, both on a project level, but also have incurred some risks to transit system operations as we've run into challenges both in funding capital maintenance, but also in the number of operators available to the system. So in November of 2022, the council adopted a new policy that would revise how projects are evaluated and advanced across the region. And really that follows 2 different paths. One relates to the subject of this presentation, which is the TPP modification and the council's role as the planning body for the region. The other relates more to Metro Transit's role and only applies when Metro Transit is implementing and operating a project, and that's more about risk management. So I won't talk about that today. Nick Thompson's not here to be a resource, but in short, there is a more structured risk management process that Metro Transit will follow as they're bringing projects through implementation and operations. On the planning side, it's really more about documenting the expectations that have already existed, that have always existed with regard to planning for transitway projects. So first and foremost, formalizing the project information that would be requested or expected from project sponsors as the TPP is considered for adoption of an amendment or a modification of a locally preferred alternative. So the council, as always, would expect documentation, study, selection report that shares the planning that went into a project and the rationale for which it is being recommended for a particular alignment and mode. There would be, as before, expectation to demonstrate local support for the project from municipalities and other directly affected government agencies along the project alignment. There would be documentation of the expected capital cost and operating cost and the anticipated revenues associated with those, as well as a documentation of public engagement. What is the public engagement process? What was the feedback? How has that been incorporated into the project's planning? Two new pieces are incorporated within this. One introduces life cycle costs, so that has emerged as a challenge across the system. So getting a better sense of life cycle cost and revenue would be one aspect of new information in the project. The other, and this more relates to transit operator and other workforce shortages, is what are the operating plans for the project? How many full-time employees, both in terms of the number of operators, but also support personnel, and does it align with expected available workforce? As before, the project would be compared to standards in the Transportation Policy Plan. None of those changed through this modification. It's just the previous application of those standards. Any changes to performance standards would be developed through the new TPP in a much broader engagement process with partners such as the TAC. And then finally, this would be implemented through this modification that's moving forward. The planning side of this graphic shows the different points with the arrows that this new policy applies. The planning side of this is in the blue arrow, where when a project is moving forward into the Transportation Policy Plan or an amendment to the project is advancing in the plan, this process would be followed. So, really the past practice here, but documenting it is the source or is the intent of the TPP modification. I'll just highlight the process that we followed here. This was introduced to the Transit Planning Technical Work Group in December. Council created a draft document that was circulated to that group in January. We received and collected feedback and responded to feedback in February and March, including a meeting with all of the commenters to discuss the comments submitted and address those to the satisfaction of the group. The updated modification was prepared and then is moving forward as information items, first to TAC planning, now to TAC, and then to TAB later this month, before the council takes up this action in May and at Transportation Committee, and then in June at Met Council. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Charles. Does anyone have any questions on this information item?
Madam Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Chad.
Just on slide 2 there, where it was the developer operator role on the right side, just wanted to reiterate our county's stance on the importance of identifying the risks, but also matching it up with the benefits and really bringing that through as well to show that on some of these projects there are great risks, but there's great benefits to the public as well. So they can outweigh the risks. So as part of that process, thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I agree with that, and it's also something that came up in the discussion on the planning side as well, and something definitely that sponsors should capture in their documentation of the selection process. It's not just what are the risks of these projects, but given all the benefits that transitways can offer, what are those benefits and that transformative opportunity from implementing this kind of infrastructure?
Alyssa?
I just want to say kudos and thank you. There was a few agencies that had a lot of comments, and Charles and others pulled those groups together and kind of went literally line by line with the updates. And so I just want to, for the group's knowledge, that they're, I think it was Minneapolis, St. Paul, Hennepin, Ramsey, Washington were in that, I think were the groups, but that they followed up very specifically with us to make sure the comments. And generally that group, I know Washington County, one, appreciated, and two, it reflected what our questions were.
Great. Okay, are there any agency reports before we adjourn for the day? We are over time by about 10 minutes.
Motion to adjourn.
Innocent, real quick.
Yeah, Madam Chair. I just want to provide this information that EPA announced available of about 400 million grants to use in improving school buses. It could be buying new EV buses or retrofitting most of them, or can use propane gas or other types of system that will help in reducing emissions in buses. So it's available for agencies, counties, cities, and tribal nations.
Okay, thank you. Do we have, you have information you want Joe to send out to the group, or is it?
Yeah, I will send it to Joe.
Okay.
Yeah, I have information.
Brian made a motion to adjourn. Anyone opposed? All right, we're adjourned.
Did we get a checkbox for that?
I was wondering if that was mine.